Hi there once again and welcome to another Expresso mechanic tutorial, and in this one we're going to be looking at trigonometric graphing. Now it's quite a versatile rig that I've set up here, but if we just play the timeline we'll see what it does. And we're generating a sine wave. Now down here we've got some controls, so we've got it set to sine in the function at the moment. If we select cosine and we go back to the beginning of the animation and play, we get the inverse of the sine. It plots a cosine wave for us. Now we've also got magnitude and we've got absolute. So if we come back to the beginning and we change the magnitude, we can see that we scale things automatically. And with the absolute here, if we switch this on, the bottom half of this disappears so that we only get positive values and we don't go from 1 to -1. So let's go back to our sine and run the timeline again and we'll see what we get. And we can see that we're getting a different output there. And then again, if we go to our cosine, perhaps adjust our magnitude so it's a little bit bigger, and then play the timeline. That's what we're getting. And this is what we're going to be about in this tutorial. So without further ado, let's see if we can make this happen. I'm going to start this by creating some user data, and we'll bring in a null and rename it controller. And then we can think about what we're going to do with our user data. So here we can add user data. For a start, we'll add a group and do our usual thing, pull it away so that it's level with the user data at the top here. And we'll call this controls. The data here we can just drop into controls, and this is going to be the function, and this will control whether we choose a sine wave or a cosine. So we need integer for the data type and we need radio buttons. So we can say 0 semicolon sin and then 1 semicolon cos. And that gives us it. If we go to our example, we can see what we're going to get, and that's perfectly good. Go back to our properties and then we can think about where we're going from here. So the next thing we need is to bring in a magnitude. Now we'll add data, rename this magnitude. Float is the data type, interface float slider, real value for the step. We can have steps of, well, it can be 1, I think 1 will be okay actually, and we'll start with a value of 10, so that will be our minimum value, and 500 will be our maximum, and we'll clamp these values, slide them in max. That's good, that's ready to go. And then finally we simply need one more user data, and this will be a checkbox, so we will require a boolean, and that's all it needs to be, so a default value of off, and this will be called absolute. Okay, so if we hit OK, we've got our controls ready to go and everything is working the way it should. Fantastic. Moving on from here then, we can bring in another null here and we'll call this curve. And we'll also bring in a tracer, and our curve is the trace link. The only thing I'm going to change in here, down here in the type, I will select cubic, and in the intermediate points, adaptive. And that will give us the curves that we want. Everything else for the moment we'll leave alone. We're going to be taking control of the trace active via Expresso, so we're going to be doing a bit of work there a little bit later. The next thing we can do is actually create another null, name it Expresso. We'll give it an Expresso tag, and we're ready to start doing a little bit of work. The first thing I'm going to bring in is the controller. And in controls, I will select absolute, magnitude, and function, and just bring those outputs there. Moving on from here, I'm just going to move this down. I'll bring in a time node, and the time node, I will actually leave the time port intact, and we'll bring in a frame port, place the frame port at the top. So those two are ready to go. Now the frame, what I'm going to be actually using this for is to control the trace active within the tracer. So we're going to be switching this on and off based upon where we are on the timeline. So what we'll do in actual fact, the timeline here, I'm going to set this to -1 because I want to be able to start plotting the curve at frame 0. If we don't do that, there'll be a slight gap when we start plotting. So we want this to be dead in the center here. We don't want it to be just slightly above. So that's why I'm doing that, so that I get the actual full sine curve or the full cosine curve. The next thing to do then, bring in a compare. So logic compare, and I'm going to compare this frame value here. And I'll compare that to equal to -1. So when we're at -1, we want something to happen. And that something will be to switch off the trace active. Now in order to do that, we need to bring in a not. So when this output is 1, we want the output of this to be 0. So we'll put that in there. Bring in the tracer. Come down to object properties, trace active, and then plumb the output of the not in there. And if we check out the tracer now, we can see that the trace active is not checked because we're at -1. So if we click forward 1 frame, we can see that we get the trace active back on, and that's exactly what we need to happen. Fantastic. So that's set up and it's ready to go. The next step is to start working with what we've got in the controller here. The first thing I'm going to bring in is a formula node. I'll bring in one of those. We don't use them often, but we're going to on this occasion. So it's going to be calculate formula. At the input stage, we'll add a value port. And we're going to be plumbing our magnitude output here into the value 1 port. Our formula, for a start, we need to check use port names. Our formula will actually be value 1, and it will be divided by 100, multiplied by 28.93. Now 28.93 is a sweet spot that I found, and what we're going to actually be using this for is to control the magnitude along the x-axis of our curve. So we're going to be controlling how far it moves along the x-axis. And if we don't do this, we're going to get a curve that's going to be quite long and it's going to sweep along over here. Now, I want to be able to scale it, and I want to be able to make it so that it is pretty much equal to the y scale. So that's what I'm doing this for. So that's our formula node. Moving on from here, we can bring in an absolute node. So again, we can calculate absolute. Bring this down here, and surprisingly enough, this is going to be used via a switch from a condition. So let's just bring one of those in. Logic condition, bring this in here, plumb the absolute into the switch. Now that's ready to go, but we need to do some more work before we get to this stage. Now, to use the absolute, we need to use a trigonometric node. So we'll bring one of those in, calculate trigonometric. So that's here and ready to go. We can just place it beneath the formula. And our time value from our time node is going to be connected to the value port here. We'll also connect the output to the absolute and just bring this down here. And then we can set this up as follows. So our trigonometric's output can go in the input 2 of the condition, and the absolute's output in the input 3. So obviously when we switch our absolute on, this will choose this port, and when it's off, we'll be using this port. So that's why that's being done. That's how that little part of it works. Okay, so what are we going to do with our formula? Well, we need two multiply nodes, so we'll bring those in. So we'll calculate math, place this over here, change its function to multiply, and then command drag to copy so that we've got two of them. So our formula, this can be plumbed into the bottom input, so input 2 of the multiply. And then once again, our time output can be plumbed into input number 1. We'll just move these up a little bit so that we can see more clearly what we're doing. And then down here for our second multiply, we can plumb the output of our condition into input number 1. And then input number 2 here simply needs the output from the magnitude, plumbed in like that. Okay, so that's the setup for those. And then the final step here is to bring in the curve, global position X, global position Y, and then plumb these in accordingly. Okay, if we just make the window a little bit bigger. And that's the first part of this expression complete. Now let's see if we get anything when we play. We can see that we've got it down here. It is quite small, so let's just zoom in on it and see what we're getting. We'll just run this timeline. We need a few more frames. We'll give ourselves 200 frames for the moment. In fact, we need 188 frames. That's what we need. And we also need to set the playback or play mode here to simple. We don't want it to repeat. So let's just see what we get. And look at that. We get a perfect sine. That's fantastic. So this is doing what we want it to. Now we should, if we go into our controller, we've got our magnitude set to 10, so it is very, very tiny. If we just zoom out a bit and we increase the magnitude, say to 237, it doesn't really matter, but straight away we can see that we're getting something much bigger. Okay, great. So that's working really nicely for us. And because we've got the formula node there, we are controlling how far it's going along the x-axis. As I say, if we don't put that formula node in and do that, we're going to get something much, much bigger. It will just get longer and longer. We don't want that. We want to be always able to control what we're seeing on the screen. But that's fantastic. That's working so far. In the tracer here, we can come down. Let's have a look, see where we are. Objects, can we control the colour? I don't think we can control it from there, or can we? No, I don't think we can from there. Let's have a look. Oh, it doesn't matter actually, because what I'm going to do is actually work with this a little bit later and do some more stuff with it. So we're actually going to be putting this into a sweep, so we'll leave that for the minute. Right, okay, great. So we know that that's working so far. So moving on from here then, we can think about bringing in some text and positioning that correctly so that we've got a 0 here, a 1 here, and a -1 down the bottom. And also we can bring in the XY coordinates. We're actually going to be representing those so that they could be rendered. That's what we're going to be about next. Actually, before we move on to that, what we need to do is bring in one more node, and it's going to be this operator node from the trigonometric here. So we just drag this operator in, because this is how we reach the function. And we need to control this from here. So we plumb that in there. Now let's go into our controller, and at the moment we're on cosine. Let's select sine. Aha, we have a problem. Now why might that be? Well, if we go into our controller's user data, we can see that there's a problem here, because what there is, well, you wouldn't necessarily see it, but I know that this is a problem. It's not 0 and 1. It should actually be 1 and 2. That control the functionality there. And if we hit OK and we select sine and cosine, now we're OK and it's all working. So if we do select the cosine now, we should be able to plot a cosine, and we can see that that's plotting the direct opposite of what we had there. And there we go, there's our cosine curve. Right, fantastic. So that's all good and that's working. In actual fact, while we're here, let's just check the absolute and see what happens there. And that we can see is working perfectly too. Fantastic. All right, so we've got it all set up and we've got it working. So be aware of that. As I've said to you before, you can't always guarantee that these menu items here start with 0. I mean, we've got a number of different functions there, but the first one is actually on number 1. It's not on 0. So be aware of that. Otherwise, you will get a yellow top. But anyway, that completes that little part of it, and we're ready to move on. We'll just close the Expresso window for a minute, and we'll bring in some text. I'm going to use MoText for this, so let's just bring that in there. Bring another one in and another one. Call this 1. This one 0 and this one -1, and then we can think about what we're doing. So I'm going to change the font. I'm going to use Lemon Milk Pro because I like it. If you haven't got Lemon Milk Pro or you want to use something else, that's absolutely fine. Let's just change the text in here to a 1, in here to a 0, and finally -1 in here. That's the text actually set up. The heights, well, I'll make it 20. We're going to take control of the height. Actually, we're going to be taking control of this. We're going to be taking control of the depth. And in the caps here, we're going to be taking control of the size via Expresso. So we can worry about that a little bit later. But for now, just to set this up, I'll leave it as it is. I think that'll be fine. Okay, fantastic. We're ready to move on and do a little bit more work in the Expresso editor. Make it a little bit bigger so that we can see what we're doing, and perhaps just scale down a little bit. Okay, so we're ready to bring some more nodes into the editor. The magnitude is going to be very important to us here because this is going to be controlling a heck of a lot. So we can start by thinking about bringing in our texts. So we'll just bring these in. We've got 1 and -1. If we just place them in this order, I think that will make life easier for us. Just hit H so that we can see what we're doing. Okay, brilliant. So we've got them all there ready to go. We can start by bringing in their coordinates. So we'll bring in position X, position Y on both of these. Position Y, and finally on this one just simply position X, because of course the 0 just stays where it is on the Y-axis. It doesn't move anywhere. Just make sure that we can see what we've got. Okay, and we're ready to move on from here. Now the magnitude we can plumb directly in to the position Y of our number 1. Okay, and that's already placed it. Now if we go into our controller here, we can see that it's placed at 237, and if we move we can see that it's scaling between 10 and 500. We'll leave that around there. Okay, that's good. So that's fine for that. Now in order to control the -1 we need a negate, so we must bring one of those in. So calculate negate. We can plumb the magnitude into here and then plumb the output of this into the position Y of the -1. So that's that set up, and now we should see in here if we've got this right. Let's have a look, see where we are. Controller. What are we doing here? We can see that it is moving. The -1 is very tiny. I don't know quite what's happened there. It seems to have gone very, very small. Let's have a look, see what we've got here. So it's still at, oh, okay. That's been scaled to 20. Let's put that back at 200. That's better. Now we can see what we're doing with that, and we can see that that's behaving as we want it to. Okay, fantastic. So we've got that underway. The next thing we need to do is think about bringing in, let's have a look, see where we are. What do I need next? I've got to work with my position. Yeah, my position X next. And in order to do that, I need a couple more math nodes. So I certainly need a multiply, so I'll command drag to copy that one, and I might as well command drag again and then just change the function of this one to a divide, because I need these two placed here. In fact, I do need another math multiply ultimately, so I may as well command drag to create another one. Okay, and we're ready to move on to our next step. Once again, this is about finding sweet spots. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to plumb the output of the magnitude into the input 1 of the divide. And I'm going to divide the magnitude by 50. And then we're going to plumb the output of the divide into the input 1 of the multiply here. And this multiply, we're going to multiply by 5. So this is the sweet spot that I've found for what we're going to be doing here. I need another negate, so I'll command drag to copy this one. And then we'll plumb the output of this multiply into the negate here. And then the output from the negate is going to be used to control the position X of all of these. So if we plumb these in accordingly, we should get the result that we want. Now, let's see what's going to happen. If we go into our controller here and we start moving, we can see that they space out. We can see that they're moving backwards and forwards, and that's what we need them to do. Okay, so that's all good, and that's placing them in their X positions, which is exactly what I want to happen. Okay, fantastic. So that's the next step complete, and we can move on from here. Now at the moment, our text is staying the same size. I want it to scale as it moves up and down and backwards and forwards. That's what I need to happen, because at the moment it's way too big. It needs to be a lot smaller than that when it's, well, in fact it needs to be smaller than that generally, because it's already it's still too big. Even at 500 it's much too big. So that's what we've got to take control of next. We've got to start thinking about controlling our depth for a start, so how deep the text is along the z-axis. We want to control this, and we also want to control the height, and we'll want to control this rounding that we're going to be putting on the text as well. They're the next things that we're going to be looking at. We'll start by bringing in the heights for all of these. So we'll come into our object properties and select height. Object properties, height. Just command double click on these to make them a little bigger. And then we're ready to start worrying about how we're going to control this. Well, we're going to be using our second multiply here. So we'll plumb the output from the divide into the input 1. And then we're going to divide, and it's going to be by a small number. It's going to be by 0.125. So a small number. And then we can simply plumb the output from this multiply into our heights. And let's see how we are now. Now at the moment we can see that we appear, I beg your pardon, I've done that wrong. I beg your pardon, it's not that one. Not that one. I'm going to say I looked at that and I thought that's a bit strange. No, the heights are actually controlled by the output from our multiply here. So we can plumb this into here. It does get a bit confusing because we do end up with a lot of connections here. Okay, now we can see that we're getting a different result. Let's see where we are. This is looking perfectly good. Now at 500 we're there. If we come down here, we can see that we're getting the perfect scaling. That's really good. If I just hit H so that we can see where we are. that's fine. I mean, at the moment, obviously the depth is ridiculous because the text is so tiny, but you can see that it's actually working quite nicely. It's scaling and it's moving in the -x direction away from the axes here, which is exactly what I want to happen. So that's working perfectly. We just got to worry about the depth now and the rounding. So that's that one done. Moving on from here, then we can bring in, I think, the size. We'll bring that in. So and also the depth. We might as well bring those both in. Let's bring in the depth first because that's object properties depth. Bring those in. That's in. So again, we'll double click, and double click. Now the depth, where are we controlling these from? They're controlled from the divide. They're controlled from here. So if we plumb this in, to here, and finally to here, and now let's see what we're getting. And now we can see straight away that that's improved things. That's much better. Let's just play around with the controller here. And yeah, we can see that that's working perfectly. So that's doing the job that I want it to. So our final thing then is the size. So if we come down into object properties, let's see where we are. Let's have a look. Pretty sure it is in object properties. It may not be. Kerning, we've got size. No, it's caps that I need to look at. Caps, I beg your pardon, it's in here, isn't it? Of course. And it's going to be M bevel, I think. In fact, it might be both bevels. Yeah, both bevels. I use both bevels. Size. There we go. So bring that one in. Caps. Where are we? Both bevels and size. And once more caps. Both bevels. Size. Okay, great. And then this will be controlled by the output of our second multiply. There we go. And as I say, spaghetti central here. I mean, there's a lot going on. It's quite involved. But now, if we play with our controller, we can see that the edge here, this beveled edge, scales perfectly. Okay, so that's our text all complete and sorted out. So yes, quite a lot of different connections going on here, but if you do it in bite-sized pieces, it's actually not too bad. And as I say, the divide and the actual multiply, it's all about finding sweet spots. Those were the sweet spots that I found for what I wanted to do. Great, so we've got that bit worked out and we're ready to move on to the next stage. Okay, let's just shut this window down and then we'll see where we go from here. Right, let's just zoom out a little bit. Okay, the next thing to do, firstly, I'm going to bring in a circle. Give it a radius of 0.2. We will actually take control of the radius of the circle, but we'll worry about that later. Drop it above the tracer, select both of them, and then Command Option, select a sweep. And we're okay there. If we play the timeline now, we find that we get a three-dimensional representation of our curve, which is what we want. We can also change this, the colour of this, and we'll make it a yellow, just somewhere there. We'll do fine. So yeah, that's what we want. Now, the 0 isn't quite in the right position. We can do some work with that. We'll select it here, go into our object and show GUI, hit O for object so that we can see where it is. Let's have a look, see what we've got. 3D GUI is selected, so why is it not visible? Is it because I've been using the filter in the edit? Okay, so let's just move the circle down until it's somewhere in the middle of the the axis somewhere around there. That should be okay. It's just about level with the centre of the world. So that's fine. That looks good. And I think I've done the same, and I've probably done it in the edit actually, but I should have shown you. I've got the same thing here. I've literally adjusted the position of the 1, and if we select the -1 and hit O, we've got the same thing down there. So that's all I've done there, just played around with the 3D GUI and just got that where I think it should be. Now you'll see why I've done this very shortly, but for now we'll just return the timeline to 0 and we'll think about moving on from here. The next thing we can think about doing is creating the x-axis and y-axis. We're going to represent those graphically. So again, I'm going to command drag to copy this circle and do the same again so that we've got 2 new ones. And we're going to create axes using extrudes. So we'll select both circles, hold down the option key this time and select extrude. And both of them are now within extrudes. Now this extrude I'll rename x-axis. And this one y-axis. So that we know what they are. The X obviously needs to offset along the X-axis and the Y along the Y-axis. So now they're in place. Now at the moment they're not 3-dimensional because the circles are not set up correctly. So the X-axis, if we go to our circle in there, we need to set that in the ZY plane. And our circle for the y-axis, the XZ plane, and now they're correct. So that's all looking good. Now the y-axis, this needs to be dropped into a symmetry object. So I'll hold down my option key, select symmetry. Again, the plane needs to be set up correctly. It needs to be the XZ plane. But now that's all working correctly. The axes at the moment are way too big, but we're going to be working with those very shortly in the Expresso window. And we can do that now because we've got everything set up and ready to go. We don't need to worry about anything else. The only thing I will do is colour these. So if we select the x-axis first, go into our basic tab and set automatic, and then we'll just give it a red colour. Same with our symmetry here. We'll automatic for our display color, and then in here we want this to be green, so that's done that. And then I can hold down my control key, copy this green, and I also need to place it on here. So once again, automatic, hold down my control key and paste that in there. Okay, that's fantastic. So that's all ready to go. The next thing, the 1, that can also be green, so automatic, hold down my option key, or rather my control key, and paste that in there. That gives that green. The 0 I'm going to leave white, and the 1 I'm going to make red. So let's have my, where am I? My x-axis. If I just hold down my control, copy that, and select automatic, control, paste. So that's all set up now, and everything is working the way it should be. In fact, saying that, I'm wrong, because what I should have done in here, you can't actually set this up in there. I should have gone into my object, my letters, and transform here. It should paste it in there. So let's just paste. What do we got here? Is that the red? Yeah, it's not the right one. So let's go into my y-axis, basic tab, copy this one and go into here in my letters and paste this in here. So that's that one done. And then my x-axis, copy this one, go into my -1 into my letters and paste this in here. And now we're correct. We've got them set up the way we need them set up. Fantastic. Right, so we've got that far. The next thing we need to worry about then is scaling. So we need to get back into the Expresso editor here and start bringing in the elements that we need to work with. The first thing we need to bring in will be a knot. So we'll go to our bool here and select a knot. We need that there. Now the knot will be taken from the absolute here. So we need to take that and plumb it into the input of the knot. And then the symmetry object we can bring in. And in the basic properties, we can select enabled because that's what we want to work with. Plumb this in here. And then we'll find that if we go to our controller and click on the absolute, that's fine. It takes the bottom half away. So the symmetry object is being switched off and it's doing its job. That's great. That's working as I want it to. Moving on from here, we can think about bringing in the extrude for our y-axis. So if we bring this in, just drop it here. And then the offset for this is what we want to work with. So we'll go into Object Properties, Offset. That can be controlled by the magnitude. We can simply drop that in there. So that's our magnitude for our y-axis. And if we look at what we've got, we're seeing that that's correct. It's now lining up with the 1, or the center of the 1 and the center of the -1. That's correct. That's doing exactly what I need it to. Brilliant. So moving on from here, I need a multiply node. So I'll command drag to copy one of those. Drop it here, and again I can plumb the magnitude into input 1. Now this needs to multiply by another magic number, and again this is 1.82. That's the sweet spot that I found for this. And this will offset the x-axis. So we'll bring this in. Again, select from the Object Properties Offset. Plumb the output of the multiply into there. And if we check the viewport, we can see that that's now been scaled accordingly. And if we run the sequence, let's just go into our controller. We've got it set to sine, that's fine. Let's just run this and you'll see what it does. And we can see that that sine wave is lining up with the end. That's perfect. That's exactly what I want. Okay, brilliant. So those are set up. The last thing we need to do is work with our circles radii. So we'll bring all of our circles in. And at the input stage, we'll give them radii ports or radius ports. Those are all ready. If we just move over a little bit, we can bring these over to here. And then we simply need to get a divide node. So we'll copy this one here, just control or command drag, I should say, to copy that. Drop it there, plumb the magnitude in. And again, we need to change the actual division, and it needs to be 250 on this occasion. That's the sweet spot once again that I've found works really well. And then we can simply plumb the output of the divide into the radius ports of our circles. And that, if I hit H, completes the Expresso. Except for one thing. Now this -1, we need to give this in our basic properties here. I'm going to do it as viewport visibility. You can do it as render visibility as well if you wish to, if you're going to render this out, but I'll just use viewport visibility. Put that in there, and all I've got to do is plumb the absolute in there. And now if we shut this down, go into our controller, hit absolute, we can see that both the bottom half of the y-axis and the -1 disappear. And that's what we need to happen. Brilliant. So that's all working nicely. And if we increase our magnitude, we can see that everything is scaling as it should, which is brilliant. That's exactly what we need to happen. If we just go back to Filter, Geometry Only, we can see that this all looks really good. And if we play the timeline, we can see that the actual sine curve has been scaled, or the actual circle that makes up the spline, or the spline curve, the sine curve, has been sailed. I don't know. I need a new pair of teeth. Has been scaled too. Fantastic. It's all working as it should. Let's just go back and do a cosine wave. And there we go. That all works beautifully. Fantastic. That's working as it should. And absolute. Let's just test that out and make sure that everything is doing what we want it to. Yep. Beautiful. Looking really nice. And then we'll do a sine wave. So yeah, all working exactly as we want it to. Fantastic. Yeah. So that completes the tutorial, actually. That's as much as I wanted to show you here. That's all working exactly as I want it to. And that's how you go about creating trigonometric graphing using Expresso. Now, I mean, if we look at the expression here, it does look complex, but when you think about it, the mathematics is all very simple stuff. It's just multiply, divide. There's not really much else going on here. Negate here, you know, and just simple logic, really, you know, and not where it's needed, and simple stuff. There's nothing particularly complicated about this at all. It's just that there's a fair amount of nodes and quite a lot of spaghetti here and there, as I've said, with the connectivity. But yeah. That's how you go about it. And as I say, if you take it in bite-sized pieces and gradually build it up, it's actually quite straightforward to actually make this work. But anyway, that's how you go about doing it, and that does bring us to the end of this tutorial. So, as always, I really hope you've enjoyed this one and that you've got a lot out of it and you can use some of this stuff in your own projects. And if you have enjoyed the video, then please give it a like, and if you haven't already, please subscribe, leave a comment, and of course, ring the bell. And wherever you happen to be on social media, then please do like this video, because all this good stuff really does help keep the channel moving in the right direction. But anyway, that just about brings the curtain down on this one. So I'll see you very soon on the next tutorial.